I am a 29-year-old male working as a lead quantitative risk analyst for a mid-sized supply chain logistics firm headquartered on the 42nd floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise. I have been with this company for exactly 4 years, having started fresh out of my master's program in applied mathematics. My base salary is $122,500 a year, which I mention only to establish that while I am comfortably compensated, I am nowhere near the executive compensation tier that drives the truly ruthless behavior in our industry. My immediate supervisor was a 45-year-old man named Marcus, who held the title of Vice President of Client Strategy. Marcus was compensated with a base salary of $250,000, supplemented by aggressive quarterly commissions tied directly to the total valuation of the contracts he closed. To understand the architecture of this conflict, it is necessary to understand the structural difference between Marcus and me. I am a numbers specialist. My job is to build complex predictive models, run Monte Carlo simulations on freight variables, and determine the exact margins of profitability for multi-year logistics contracts. I sit in a standard open-plan cubicle farm, surrounded by dual monitors and whiteboards covered in regression formulas. Marcus, on the other hand, was an ideas guy. He occupied a sprawling corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass, spending his days taking clients to steakhouses, playing golf, and speaking in corporate platitudes that sounded impressive but lacked any empirical foundation. We had a functional but incredibly strained working relationship. He viewed me as a pessimistic human calculator whose only purpose was to generate the spreadsheets he used to secure his bonuses, while I viewed him as a dangerous liability who routinely promised deliverables that our operational infrastructure could barely support. The catalyst for our entire conflict began in late August of last year. Our firm was aggressively courting a massive national hardware retail conglomerate. This was not a standard account. The proposed contract was a 5-year exclusive logistics partnership valued at roughly $58 million. Securing this account would single-handedly carry our firm's third-quarter revenue goals and, crucially, would trigger a massive performance bonus for Marcus. According to the internal executive compensation structures that I later became privy to during the subsequent legal fallout, Marcus was positioned to take home a one-time bonus of $175,000 if the contract was signed before the fiscal quarter closed on September 30th. My responsibility on this project was to analyze the client's historical shipping data, factor in macroeconomic variables like fuel inflation, labor shortages, and seasonal volume spikes, and generate a binding pricing tier that guaranteed our firm a minimum profit margin of 12%. I spent 3 grueling weeks building a highly sophisticated dynamic model. Because global freight and diesel prices had been wildly volatile, I built an algorithmic buffer into our pricing. This buffer meant that if fuel costs spiked, the client absorbed a proportionate share of the burden, protecting our firm from catastrophic losses. I finalized the executive summary deck on a Tuesday evening at roughly 8:30, sent the encrypted file to Marcus for his review, and logged off, exhausted but confident in the structural integrity of my math. The following morning, at approximately 9:15, I logged into our shared corporate drive to review the final presentation file that Marcus was preparing for the client pitch scheduled for Thursday afternoon. As I scrolled through the financial projection slides, I noticed a catastrophic discrepancy. The final pricing tiers were drastically lower than the numbers my model had generated. I immediately pulled up the master spreadsheet linked to the presentation and discovered that my dynamic fuel inflation algorithm had been completely overridden. Someone had manually deleted my complex standard deviation formulas and hard-coded a flat, static 1.5% annual increase across all freight variables for the entire 5-year duration of the contract. Furthermore, the volume discount thresholds had been aggressively manipulated, offering the client massive price breaks that our operational margins simply could not sustain. I ran a quick differential analysis and felt my stomach drop. By locking in a static fuel price based on a current 3-year market low and aggressively discounting the volume tiers, the revised numbers presented a highly attractive, low-cost solution to the client. However, it also meant that our firm would be legally bound to absorb any market volatility. Based on my conservative macroeconomic projections, this altered model would not just fail to meet our 12% profit mandate, it would actively hemorrhage money. I calculated that by year 3 of the contract, our firm would be operating at a net loss, and by the end of the 5-year term, we would have subsidized the client's shipping costs to the tune of $4.6 million. I immediately stood up and walked to Marcus's corner office. I knocked on his open glass door and requested 5 minutes of his time to discuss a critical error in the Omega account financial deck. He waved me in dismissively, keeping his eyes on his phone. I explained to him, methodically and calmly, that the fuel inflation variable had been hard-coded, entirely disabling the dynamic pricing algorithm I had built. I informed him that presenting these numbers would commit our firm to a contract that was mathematically guaranteed to result in a multi-million-dollar deficit. Marcus did not look surprised. Instead, he sighed heavily and adopted a deeply condescending tone. He explained to me that the numbers I generated were too conservative and that if we presented my original pricing model, the client would simply take their business to our competitors. He insisted that the hard-coded 1.5% figure was a strategic narrative tool designed to get the client's signature on the dotted line. He assured me that once the ink was dry, our legal team could find loopholes in the service-level agreements to renegotiate the margins, or that we would simply find operational efficiencies down the road to make up the difference. I firmly reiterated that you cannot find $4.6 million in operational efficiencies on a contract with razor-thin margins. I explicitly warned him that presenting these altered numbers constituted gross misrepresentation. I told him that as the lead actuary on the project, I could not attach my name to a financial projection that I knew to be fundamentally flawed. Marcus stood up, leaned over his desk, and informed me that my job was to provide the data, but his job was to close the deal. He explicitly ordered me to drop the issue, stating that I lacked the executive business acumen to understand high-stakes corporate strategy. He then mandated that I attend the pitch meeting the next day, solely in an observational capacity, instructing me to sit quietly and only speak if directly asked a technical question about our software integration. I returned to my desk feeling incredibly compromised. The corporate hierarchy dictated that I follow my vice president's directives, but my professional ethics and my deep fear of legal liability screamed that I was participating in a massive financial fraud. I spent Wednesday evening documenting everything. I took timestamped screenshots of my original model, the timestamped log showing when Marcus accessed and altered the master file, and his revised presentation deck. I saved all of this to a secure, personal, external hard drive, terrified that I would eventually be used as the scapegoat when the contract inevitably imploded 2 years down the line. The pitch meeting took place on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock in our flagship executive boardroom. The room was intimidating, featuring a massive mahogany table overlooking Lake Michigan. The client had flown in 3 high-level executives, including their chief financial officer, a fiercely intelligent woman in her late 50s who had a reputation for tearing vendor contracts to shreds. Our side of the table consisted of Marcus, myself, our director of operations, and our in-house corporate counsel. For the first 45 minutes, Marcus was in his element. He was charming, persuasive, and utilized all his practiced corporate jargon to paint a picture of a seamless, hyper-efficient partnership. Then he transitioned to slide 14, the 5-year cost projection. He confidently presented the aggressively low figures, boasting about our firm's ability to offer unparalleled cost stability in a volatile market. The client CFO leaned forward, adjusted her glasses, and stared intensely at the screen. She pointedly asked Marcus how our firm could possibly guarantee a flat 1.5% fuel surcharge cap over a half-decade, noting that global diesel prices had fluctuated by more than 20% in the last 18 months alone. She directly questioned whether we were utilizing a dynamic predictive model or simply swallowing the risk to buy her business. This was the pivotal moment. If Marcus had admitted that the numbers were aggressive estimates and offered to show her the variable pricing tiers, the situation might have been salvaged. Instead, Marcus doubled down on the lie. He looked the CFO dead in the eye and confidently stated that the numbers on the screen were the direct output of our proprietary dynamic Monte Carlo simulations. He explicitly claimed that our quantitative risk team, gesturing directly at me, had modeled 10,000 market scenarios, and that the presented figures represented the absolute mathematical ceiling of their projected costs, fully insulated by our internal algorithmic hedging. He was using my presence and my professional credibility to validate a fraudulent number that he had manually typed into an Excel cell 24 hours prior. The CFO looked at me directly. She asked me, specifically referencing my title as lead quantitative analyst, to explain the standard deviation parameters of the Monte Carlo simulation that produced such an incredibly flat fuel projection. The room went completely silent. Every eye turned to me. I looked at Marcus, who was giving me a subtle, tight-lipped smile, clearly expecting me to play along and validate his lie. In that fraction of a second, I calculated my own risk. If I lied and verified his numbers, I would be actively participating in defrauding a major corporation, potentially exposing myself to personal legal liability, immediate termination when the numbers inevitably failed, and the complete destruction of my professional reputation. I took a deep breath, opened my laptop, and connected my screen to the secondary boardroom projector. I looked directly at the client CFO and stated clearly that there had been a severe version control error in the presentation deck. I explained that the numbers currently displayed on slide 14 did not represent the output of our dynamic modeling, but were rather a static, unsimulated baseline. I then projected my original, unaltered financial model onto the screen. I methodically walked the client through the actual algorithmic projections, demonstrating the variable pricing tiers, the realistic market fluctuation buffers, and the true projected costs. I explained that while our firm could offer exceptional service and competitive baseline rates, a flat 1.5% cap was mathematically impossible without exposing our firm to a projected $4.6 million liability, a risk that our internal governance did not permit us to take. The atmosphere in the room shifted from professional curiosity to absolute freezing tension. The CFO stared at my actual numbers, nodded slowly, and took meticulous notes. Marcus's face had drained of all color, turning a mottled shade of pale gray. He attempted to interrupt me twice, trying to claim that my data was an outdated internal stress test, but the CFO raised her hand and firmly instructed him to let me finish my technical breakdown. After I concluded my explanation, the CFO closed her notebook. She thanked me for my transparency and analytical rigor. She then looked directly at Marcus, stated that her company valued vendor honesty above all other metrics, and announced that they would need to take a brief recess to discuss these new revelations privately. The client executive stood up and walked out of the boardroom. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut, Marcus exploded. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, shattering his water glass, and began screaming at me. He accused me of intentional corporate sabotage, claiming that I had just tanked a $58 million deal out of petty professional jealousy. He stated that my career in logistics was permanently over and demanded that I immediately pack up my desk and leave the building. Our in-house counsel, who had remained silent during the entire presentation, calmly intervened, instructing Marcus to sit down and advising everyone to stop speaking immediately to prevent any further internal liability. The client executives returned 15 minutes later. The CFO addressed our director of operations, entirely bypassing Marcus. She stated that they were still highly interested in our operational capabilities and appreciated the robust accuracy of our actual risk models. However, she stipulated that they would only proceed with contract negotiations on the condition that Marcus was entirely removed from the account and that I was appointed as the primary financial liaison moving forward. We concluded the meeting under an aura of suffocating awkwardness. As we rode the elevator back down to our office floor in complete silence, Marcus turned to me and stated, in a voice shaking with rage, that I was to report directly to Human Resources the moment the doors opened. The subsequent HR meeting was a masterclass in corporate dysfunction. We sat in a small, windowless office with Linda, a 52-year-old HR director who clearly despised confrontation. Marcus immediately launched into a formal grievance, demanding my immediate termination for gross insubordination and actively undermining a superior in front of a major client. He argued that my actions constituted a breach of professional conduct and had caused irreparable damage to the company's reputation. I calmly opened my laptop, which I had brought into the meeting, and pulled up the time-stamped documentation I had gathered the night before. I showed Linda the original risk model. I showed her the audit logs proving that Marcus had manually deleted the formulas and hard-coded the fraudulent numbers. I then explained that during the meeting, Marcus had explicitly attributed those altered numbers to my proprietary simulation, effectively attempting to force me to commit corporate fraud. I stated that correcting the numbers was not insubordination, but rather a necessary execution of my fiduciary duty to protect the firm from a $4.6 million loss and potential litigation from the client. Linda looked completely overwhelmed. She recognized immediately that this was no longer a standard behavioral dispute, but a massive compliance crisis. She suspended both of us with full pay, pending a comprehensive internal investigation, confiscated our corporate laptops, and instructed us to leave the premises. I did not wait for the company to decide my fate. The moment I got home, I retained the services of an employment and corporate whistleblower attorney named David, who charged $350 an hour. I provided him with copies of all the documentation I had secured on my personal hard drive. The following Monday, David sent a highly aggressive preservation of evidence letter to our company's chief executive officer, chief risk officer, and the board of directors. The letter explicitly outlined Marcus's attempt to falsify financial projections, his attempt to coerce me into validating the fraud, and my protected status as an internal whistleblower who had prevented a catastrophic financial liability. This legal maneuver triggered a massive internal upheaval. The company was forced to hire an external forensic accounting firm to audit the entire Omega account proposal. For 2 weeks, I sat at home, fielding daily phone calls from David as he navigated the corporate fallout. The investigation revealed layers of systemic rot that went far beyond a single bad presentation. The forensic auditors dug into Marcus's corporate email archives and uncovered a series of devastating communications. They found direct evidence that Marcus was fully aware that the altered numbers would result in a massive loss for our firm. However, they also uncovered the motive. Marcus was in late-stage negotiations to accept a C-suite position at a rival logistics firm with a planned start date in early January. His strategy was to secure the Omega account, collect his $175,000 quarterly bonus in October, and resign before the financial realities of the toxic contract began impacting our firm's balance sheets the following year. He was intentionally sabotaging our firm's long-term financial health to fund his own golden parachute. When this information was presented to the executive board, the resolution was swift and brutal. Marcus was immediately terminated for cause, specifically for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, which entirely invalidated his severance package and any pending bonuses. Our legal department also informed him that they were exploring civil litigation to recoup the costs of the forensic audit, though I suspect that was mostly an intimidation tactic to ensure his silence. The following Thursday, exactly 3 weeks after the disastrous pitch meeting, I was called back into the office. I met directly with the CEO and the Chief Risk Officer. They were incredibly careful with their phrasing, strictly adhering to the advice of their corporate counsel. They did not explicitly thank me for embarrassing a vice president in front of a client, as that violated standard corporate etiquette. However, they acknowledged that my commitment to data integrity had saved the firm from a devastating financial and legal exposure. To formally resolve the situation and preempt any potential hostile work environment lawsuits from my attorney, the company offered me a substantial restructuring package. I was promoted to the title of Director of Quantitative Strategy. My base salary was increased from $122,500 to $165,000 a year. Furthermore, I was awarded a one-time retention bonus of $40,000, heavily contingent on my signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding the specific circumstances of Marcus's termination. The Omega account contract was eventually signed, utilizing my original, mathematically sound pricing model. The client's CFO personally requested that I be present for the final signing ceremony, cementing a highly profitable relationship that remains active today. Despite the overwhelming objective evidence that my actions saved the company millions of dollars and exposed an actively malicious executive, a quiet faction of middle management within the firm still views me with deep suspicion. Several senior sales directors have made passive-aggressive comments in the break room, suggesting that regardless of the math, publicly humiliating a vice president in front of a $50 million client was a massive violation of the unwritten corporate hierarchy. They argue that I should have validated Marcus's numbers in the room, protected the firm's unified front, and then escalated the discrepancy to the CEO privately after the client had left the building. I absolutely refuse to accept this premise. I maintain that yielding to corporate hierarchy in the face of blatant, actionable fraud is cowardice. I refuse to apologize for prioritizing mathematical truth and my own legal safety over the fragile ego of a corrupt executive, even if it meant breaking the sacred rule of never contradicting a boss in public.